Imagine spending 7 years in a space so small you couldn't stand up. 7 years watching your children grow through a peephole, close enough to hear their voices but unable to hold them. 7 years of your body slowly breaking down in darkness. Now imagine that this wasn't defeat. This was strategy. This was a mother named Harriet Jacobs turning the most brutal confinement into the most brilliant escape, and then doing something even more remarkable. She taught herself to write so powerfully that her words would shake the foundations of American slavery itself. But here's what haunts me about her story. How does someone go from being property, from hiding in a space the size of a coffin for 7 years, to becoming one of the most important voices in American literature? What happens inside a person during those years of darkness that transforms them into someone who can change history? Stay until the end, because the answer reveals something profound about what we're actually capable of when everything is taken from us except our will to be free. Let's go back to February 11, 1813 in Edenton, North Carolina. Harriet Ann Jacobs was born into a world that didn't recognize her as fully human. But here's the thing about her early childhood. She didn't know she was enslaved. Her family, especially her grandmother, Molly Horniblow, created such a protective bubble around her that she spent her first years unaware of her station in life. She played like other children. She laughed. She dreamed. Her grandmother, Molly, was extraordinary in her own right. She'd been emancipated during the American Revolution, then sold back into slavery as a prize of war, then freed again. By the time Harriet was born, Molly owned her own house in Edenton. She'd built a life through sheer determination, running a bakery, saving money, creating a space of relative safety in a world designed to crush black people's aspirations. That house would later become the most important location in Harriet's life, but we'll get to that. When Harriet was 6 years old, her mother died. That's when the protective bubble burst. She was sent to live in the household of Margaret Horniblow as a slave, and the full weight of what that meant started to press down on her young shoulders. But even then, she had something most enslaved people were denied. Margaret Horniblow taught her to read and write. She taught her to sew. For a brief time, Harriet had something resembling a childhood, even within slavery's constraints. That literacy was like a seed planted in her mind, waiting for the right conditions to grow into something powerful. She could read the Bible. She could write letters. She could access a world of ideas that most enslaved people were deliberately kept from. Slaveholders understood that literacy was dangerous. A person who could read might read about freedom. A person who could write might write their own story, might document the truth of what slavery actually was. When Margaret Horniblow died in 1825, 12-year-old Harriet was willed to Margaret's 3-year-old niece, Mary Matilda Norcom. But the real power in that household belonged to Mary's father, Dr. James Norcom. And that's where Harriet's story takes a dark turn that would define the next decade of her life. Everything changed when Harriet turned 15 years old. That's when Dr. James Norcom, her enslaver, began what he probably thought of as seduction, but what we need to call by its real name: sexual harassment, predation. He was a prominent physician, a plantation owner, a man with absolute legal power over her body. And he started whispering what Harriet later called foul words in her ear. Let me be clear about what was happening here. This wasn't romance. This wasn't complicated. This was a man exploiting his position of total power over a teenage girl who legally had no right to say no. He made persistent, repeated sexual advances. He attempted assault. And when she resisted, he threatened to sell her children if she didn't submit. Norcom's harassment wasn't just physical, it was psychological warfare. He would follow her around the house, he would corner her in rooms, he would whisper threats and promises. He would remind her constantly that she was his property, that he could do whatever he wanted with her, that resistance was futile. His wife, Mary Matilda Norcom, knew what was happening. But instead of protecting Harriet, she blamed her. She treated Harriet with jealousy and cruelty, as if a 15-year-old enslaved girl had any choice in the matter. Think about what it means to live like that, to wake up every day knowing that the man who owns you is waiting for an opportunity to assault you, to have no legal recourse, no protection, no way to say no that would be respected, to know that if you fight back, you'll be punished, to know that if you tell anyone, you'll be called a liar or blamed for tempting him. This was the reality for countless enslaved women, but most of their stories were never written down, never documented, never told. But here's where Harriet's story takes a turn that makes some people uncomfortable, and we need to sit with that discomfort because it reveals something crucial about resistance under impossible conditions. At 15 years old, facing relentless harassment from Norcom, Harriet made a calculated decision. She entered into a relationship with a white lawyer named Samuel Treadwell Sawyer. She chose her own terms rather than submitting to her enslaver's demands. Think about the intelligence that required, the strategic thinking. She couldn't escape Norcom's power directly. The law gave him total control, so she found a way to assert agency in a situation designed to strip her of all agency. As one account put it, it was not Harriet Jacobs' nature to give up without a fight. She was fighting with the only weapons available to her. She was claiming some small measure of choice in a system designed to give her none. This decision gave her 2 children, a son, Joseph, born in 1829, and a daughter, Louisa Matilda, born October 19, 1833, and it enraged Dr. Norcom. His retaliation was swift and brutal. He sent her to one of his plantations, separating her from her children, from her grandmother, from everything that made life bearable. He wanted to break her. He wanted to punish her for daring to resist him, for daring to choose someone else, for daring to act as if she had any control over her own body. On that plantation, Harriet faced the full brutality of slavery. The endless labor, the inadequate food, the constant threat of violence, the isolation from everyone she loved. But she also started planning. She started thinking about escape. She started imagining a life where she and her children could be free. That's when Harriet made a decision that would define the next 7 years of her life. She was going to disappear. In 1835, Harriet Jacobs vanished. Dr. Norcom searched everywhere. He put out notices in newspapers, he offered rewards, he interrogated her family, he sent slave catchers to search the surrounding area. He was obsessed with finding her, with reasserting his control, with punishing her for escaping. He never imagined that she was less than 100 feet away, hiding in her grandmother's attic. Let me describe this space to you because it's important that you understand exactly what she endured. The crawl space above her grandmother's shed measured 9 feet long by 7 feet wide. The height varied between 3 and 5 feet at its highest point. For 7 years, Harriet Jacobs lived in a space where she couldn't stand up, where she couldn't stretch, where the summer heat was suffocating and the winter cold cut through to her bones. She called it her loophole of retreat. That phrase is brilliant, isn't it? It transforms unbearable confinement into strategic resistance. It takes a space no taller than a coffin and reimagines it as a doorway to freedom. It reclaims language itself as a tool of resistance. A loophole is a way around an unjust law. A retreat is a strategic withdrawal to fight another day. She wasn't hiding in defeat. She was positioning herself for victory. But the physical reality was brutal. Let me walk you through what 7 years in that space actually meant. The first challenge was simply existing in a space not designed for human habitation. The attic had no windows. The air was stale and close. In summer, the North Carolina heat turned the space into an oven. Temperatures would climb above 100 degrees. She would lie there, unable to move without bumping into the slanted roof, sweat soaking through her clothes, struggling to breathe in air that felt thick and suffocating. In winter, it was the opposite torture. The cold would seep through every crack in the wood. She had no heat source. She would wrap herself in whatever blankets her family could sneak to her, but it was never enough. Her joints would ache. Her fingers would go numb. She would shiver through long nights, listening to the wind howl outside, knowing that her children were warm in the house below while she froze above them. The lack of exercise caused health problems that persisted for the rest of her life. Her legs would cramp, her back would spasm. She spent hours at a time unconscious with no access to medical attention. Her body was slowly breaking down in that darkness. She developed rheumatism that would plague her for decades. Her circulation suffered, her muscles atrophied. By the time she finally escaped, she could barely walk. But worse than the physical suffering was the psychological torture. She drilled a small peephole in the wall. She could watch through cracks in the floor. Joseph and Louisa Matilda lived with their great-grandmother in the house below. Harriet could hear their voices. She could watch them play in the street. She could see them growing up, changing, becoming people she didn't know anymore. Can you imagine that torture? To be close enough to hear your children laugh but unable to reveal yourself. To watch them search for you, call for you, miss you, and have to stay silent. To see them sad and confused about where their mother went, and not be able to comfort them. Joseph was 6 years old when she disappeared. Louisa Matilda was only 2. They were so young, they needed her, and she was right there, separated by a few feet of wood and plaster, but it might as well have been 1,000 miles. She would watch Joseph playing in the yard and see him looking around, as if he could sense her presence. She would hear Louisa Matilda asking her great-grandmother where Mama was, and she would have to bite her hand to keep from crying out, from revealing herself, from ruining everything. The isolation was crushing. For 7 years, she had almost no human contact. Her grandmother would bring her food at night, sneaking up to the attic when it was safe. Her uncle would occasionally visit, but most of the time she was alone. Alone with the constant question of whether this sacrifice would be worth it. Because that's what those 7 years were. A sacrifice. Harriet wasn't hiding to save herself. She was hiding to protect her children. As long as she was missing, as long as Dr. Norcom was searching for her, he couldn't sell her children south. He kept them close, thinking they might lead him to her. And that meant they stayed with her grandmother in relative safety, growing up free in every way except legally. She had to believe that Samuel Sawyer, their father, would eventually purchase them and free them. She had to believe that her sacrifice was buying them time, buying them a chance at a better life. She had to believe that one day she would be reunited with them in freedom. Without that belief, without that hope, she might have given up. She might have turned herself in. She might have decided that living in a coffin wasn't worth it. But she didn't give up. She endured, she survived, and she planned. During those 7 years, Harriet wasn't just hiding. She was gathering intelligence. She was watching the street through her peephole. She was listening to conversations. She was learning about the movements of slave catchers, about ships leaving the harbor, about the network of people who might help her escape. She was preparing for the moment when she could finally make her move. She also did something remarkable. She wrote letters. Her family would smuggle paper and pen to her. She would write letters to Dr. Norcom, pretending to be in New York or Boston. She would have these letters mailed from those cities by friends who were traveling. Norcom would receive a letter in Harriet's handwriting, postmarked from hundreds of miles away, and he would send slave catchers to search those cities while she remained hidden in his own town. Think about the psychological warfare she was waging. She was turning his own obsession against him. She was making him chase shadows. She was proving that even in confinement, even in a space where she couldn't stand, she had more power than he realized. She could manipulate him. She could outsmart him. She could make him look foolish. Before her daughter Louisa Matilda left Edenton, Harriet broke her silence just once. She revealed herself to her daughter, swearing her to secrecy. She did the same with her son Joseph. Those moments of connection, brief as they were, must have been everything. Proof that she was still their mother, proof that her sacrifice had meaning, proof that she loved them enough to endure this hell. Imagine that reunion. Louisa Matilda was 9 years old. She'd spent 7 years believing her mother had run away, had abandoned her, and suddenly her grandmother takes her up to the attic, and there's her mother, emerging from the shadows. What do you say? How do you explain that you were there the whole time, watching, unable to reach out? How does a child process that? And Joseph, 13 years old enough to understand the danger, old enough to keep the secret. Did he feel angry that she'd been so close and never revealed herself? Did he feel grateful that she'd sacrificed so much? Did he feel scared about what would happen if anyone found out? We don't have detailed records of those conversations, but we know this: the children kept the secret. They didn't tell anyone. They protected their mother the way she'd been protecting them, and that must have given Harriet the strength to endure a little longer. 7 years. Let that sink in. 7 years of your life in a space where you can't stand. 7 years watching your children grow up without you. 7 years of physical agony and psychological torment. Most people would have broken. Most people would have given up, turned themselves in, accepted their fate. Harriet Jacobs waited. She endured. She survived. And she planned. In 1842, an opportunity finally came. A free black man named Peter, a waterman with access to ships, arranged her escape. Her grandmother initially tried to talk her out of it. The risk was enormous. If she was caught, the punishment would be unspeakable. Dr. Norcom would make an example of her. He would sell her to the deep south, to the cotton plantations where enslaved people worked themselves to death. He would separate her from her children forever. He would make sure she never had another chance at freedom. But Harriet had spent 7 years preparing for this moment. She wasn't going to let fear stop her now. Her body was broken, her health was destroyed, but her will was unbreakable. She was getting out. She was going to find her children. She was going to claim the freedom she'd been fighting for all these years. She boarded a ship in Edenton and sailed north to Philadelphia. Can you imagine that first moment when she could stand up fully? When she could stretch her legs, when she could breathe air that wasn't stale and suffocating, when she could see the sky without looking through a crack, when she could feel the wind on her face and know that she was moving toward freedom. The journey must have been terrifying. Every moment she must have expected to be discovered. Every sound must have made her heart race. Every person who looked at her must have seemed like a potential slave catcher. But she made it. She survived the voyage. She arrived in Philadelphia, a free city, a place where slavery didn't exist. In Philadelphia, she was met at the docks by Reverend Jeremiah Durham, an anti-slavery activist who was part of the network helping escaped slaves reach safety. From there, she traveled by train to New York City, and there, finally, she was reunited with Joseph and Louisa Matilda. I want you to think about that reunion. 7 years apart, her children had been young when she disappeared. Now Joseph was 13, Louisa Matilda was 9. They'd grown up with stories of their mother, with memories that had probably faded and blurred. And suddenly, she was real again, standing in front of them, holding them. What do you say to your children after 7 years? How do you explain that you were there the whole time, watching, unable to reach out? How do they process that their mother chose to live in a coffin-sized space rather than be separated from them completely? How do you rebuild a relationship that's been frozen in time while everyone has changed? We don't have detailed records of that reunion, but we know this. The family stayed together. Harriet and her children and her brother John, who'd also escaped, reunited in New England. They'd made it to the free North. They'd survived. They were together. But here's the thing about freedom in 1842. It wasn't really freedom. The fugitive slave law meant that Dr. Norcom could still come after her. She was legally still his property. She'd escaped, but she wasn't safe. Slave catchers could kidnap her off the streets of New York and drag her back to North Carolina, and the law would be on their side. For 10 years, Harriet lived in this liminal space, free but not free. She worked as a domestic servant for a family in New York, the Willis family. She tried to build a life. She tried to give her children stability. She tried to create some sense of normalcy after years of trauma and separation. But the threat was always there, hovering over everything. She couldn't relax. She couldn't feel truly safe. She had to be constantly vigilant, constantly aware that her freedom was provisional, that it could be taken away at any moment. Working for the Willis family gave her some measure of security. Nathaniel Parker Willis was a writer and editor. His wife, Mary Stace Willis, became Harriet's employer and, in some ways, her protector. But the relationship was complicated. Harriet was grateful for the work, for the relative safety, for the kindness the family showed her. But she was also acutely aware that she was still in a subordinate position, still dependent on white people's goodwill for her survival. She watched her children grow up during these years. Joseph became a young man. Louisa Matilda became a young woman. They were building lives in the North, lives that would have been impossible in slavery. But they were also navigating the complex reality of being black in America, even in the supposedly free North. They faced discrimination, they faced limited opportunities, they faced that constant awareness that their freedom was fragile. Then, in 1852, Dr. Norcom's family came to New York. They'd found her. They were going to take her back. Harriet's employer, Cornelia Grinnell Willis, Nathaniel's second wife after Mary died, did something that saved her life, but also complicated her freedom in ways that would haunt Harriet. Willis purchased Harriet's freedom from the Norcom family for $300. She paid money to legally free someone who believed she should never have been enslaved in the first place. Think about how that must have felt, to have your freedom purchased like a commodity, to owe your legal status as a human being to someone else's money, to know that you're only safe because someone bought you, just like Dr. Norcom had owned you, just like you'd been bought and sold your whole life. Harriet was grateful to Willis. Of course she was. Willis had saved her from being dragged back to slavery. Willis had given her legal protection. Willis had done something genuinely kind and generous. But Harriet also understood the bitter irony. Even her freedom was transactional. Even her humanity had a price tag. She'd escaped slavery only to have her freedom purchased, which meant that on some level, the system still treated her as property, still treated her as something that could be bought and sold. But now, finally, she was legally free. The threat was gone. Her children were safe, and Harriet started to think about what she could do with this freedom she'd fought so hard to claim. She started to write. Now, here's where we need to talk about what it meant for Harriet Jacobs to become a writer. She wasn't formally educated. She'd taught herself to read as a child, but writing a full-length book? That was something else entirely. That required not just literacy, but literary skill. It required understanding narrative structure, pacing, character development. It required finding a voice that could speak to a white audience about experiences they couldn't imagine without alienating them or diminishing the truth of what she'd endured. And she had to do all of this while knowing that people wouldn't believe her, that they'd dismiss her story as fiction, that they'd question whether a formerly enslaved black woman could possibly write with such sophistication. Throughout the 1850s, Harriet worked on her manuscript. She wrote in the evenings after her work was done. She wrote in stolen moments when she had privacy. She wrote and rewrote, crafting her story, finding her voice, deciding what to include and what to leave out. She had to make difficult decisions about how to tell her story. How much detail should she include about Dr. Torrey? Norcom's harassment? How should she explain her relationship with Samuel Sawyer? How could she convey the horror of slavery without making her readers so uncomfortable that they stopped reading? How could she maintain her dignity while describing experiences designed to strip her of dignity? She decided to use a pseudonym. She would publish under the name Linda Brent. This gave her some protection, some distance from the story. It meant that if people judged her, if they questioned her choices, if they said cruel things about her, those judgments would fall on Linda Brent, not on Harriet Jacobs. It meant her children wouldn't have to carry the burden of their mother's public testimony. It meant she could tell the whole truth without worrying about the social consequences. She also changed all the names in the book. Dr. Norcom became Dr. Flint. Samuel Sawyer became Mr. Sands. Her grandmother became Aunt Martha. Her children became Benny and Ellen. This was partly for legal protection, but it was also a literary choice. It transformed her personal story into something universal. It made her experience representative of what countless enslaved women endured. And here's what made her book revolutionary. She talked about sex. She talked about sexual harassment and abuse. She talked about the ways enslaved women were exploited, violated, treated as objects for white men's pleasure. This was 1850s America. Polite society didn't discuss these things. Women, especially, were expected to maintain silence about sexual matters. The cult of true womanhood demanded that women be pure, pious, submissive, and domestic. Talking about sexual violence violated all of those expectations. But Harriet understood something crucial. The silence was part of the system. The secrets of slavery, as she called them, were concealed deliberately. If people in the North didn't know about the sexual violence, they could maintain their comfortable distance from slavery's full horror. They could imagine slavery as a labor system, as an economic arrangement, without confronting the reality that it was also a system of sexual exploitation and abuse. So she broke the silence. She used what she called the language of polite letters to discuss taboo subjects. She wrote in a way that Victorian audiences could read without being scandalized into dismissal, but she didn't soften the truth. She made it clear that sexual exploitation defined slavery for slave girls, not just her. All of them. Every enslaved woman lived with the threat of sexual violence. Every enslaved woman had to navigate the predatory behavior of white men who had absolute power over their bodies. She worked with an editor named Lydia Maria Child, an abolitionist and writer who helped her refine the manuscript. Child wrote an introduction vouching for the book's authenticity. She helped Harriet navigate the publishing world. She provided editorial guidance while respecting Harriet's voice and vision. Their collaboration was a model of how white allies could support black voices without trying to control or co-opt them. And in 1861, right as the Civil War was beginning, Harriet published Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. The timing was significant. The country was tearing itself apart over slavery. The question of what slavery actually was, what it did to people, was suddenly urgent and unavoidable. Harriet's book entered that conversation with the authority of lived experience. The book was groundbreaking. It was one of the first published works to explicitly discuss the sexual abuse of enslaved women. It became important to both the anti-slavery movement and the emerging women's rights movement. Here was a woman who'd survived the worst of slavery's cruelties and transformed her suffering into literature that could change minds and hearts. Harriet sent copies to abolitionists, to politicians, to anyone she thought might be influenced by her testimony. She wanted her story to matter. She wanted it to contribute to ending slavery. She wanted the 7 years in the attic, the decades of suffering, the courage it took to write it all down. She wanted all of that to mean something. And it did. The book was read and discussed. It was reviewed in newspapers. It was used by abolitionists to argue for slavery's end. It gave people in the North a window into the lived reality of slavery, especially for women. It made the abstract concrete. It made the distant immediate. It made the unimaginable real. But here's where the story takes a turn that reveals something devastating about how we treat black women's voices. For over a century, Harriet Jacobs' autobiography was dismissed as fiction. Critics said it was too well written to be authentic. They said the narrative depicted Linda Brent as a tragic heroine from British romance novels rather than as an enslaved black woman. They used her literary sophistication as evidence against her truthfulness. Think about that logic. She wrote too well, therefore she must be lying. Her story was too compelling, therefore it must be invented. The very skills she'd developed, the very voice she'd crafted, became weapons used to discredit her. For over 100 years, one of the most important first-hand accounts of slavery was treated as a novel. Harriet's testimony was erased. Her truth was dismissed. And this happened not because there was evidence against her, but because people couldn't believe that a formerly enslaved black woman could write with such power. Scholars debated whether Linda Brent was a real person. They questioned whether Lydia Maria Child had actually written the book and just attributed it to a fictional enslaved woman. They treated Harriet's life story as a literary curiosity rather than as historical testimony. They analyzed it for its narrative techniques while ignoring its truth claims. This erasure had consequences. It meant that for over a century, one of the most important voices documenting slavery's sexual violence was dismissed. It meant that the specific experiences of enslaved women were treated as less credible, less important, less real than the experiences of enslaved men. It meant that Harriet's courage in breaking the silence was met with a different kind of silence, the silence of disbelief and dismissal. It wasn't until 1981 that a scholar named Jean Fagan Yellin did the detective work to prove what should never have been doubted. Yellin spent years researching. She found letters Harriet had written to her friend Amy Post, a Quaker abolitionist and women's rights activist. She found letters to Lydia Maria Child discussing the manuscript. She traced the archival record. She followed every clue. She documented Harriet's life, her family, her movements, her work. And she published evidence that established beyond any doubt that Harriet Jacobs was real, that her story was true, that incidents in the life of a slave girl was exactly what it claimed to be, a first-hand account written by herself. 120 years. That's how long it took for Harriet's truth to be officially recognized. And even then, it was only because a white scholar did the work. A black woman scholar named Marion Starling had worked on establishing Jacobs's identity before Yellin, but her work didn't receive the same recognition. Even the story of vindicating Harriet's truth has layers of erasure within it. But let's go back to 1861, to Harriet herself, because her story doesn't end with publication. The Civil War had just begun. Slavery was tearing the country apart, and Harriet saw an opportunity to do more than write about freedom. She could help create it. In 1863, more than 2 years before the war ended, Harriet traveled to Alexandria, Virginia. The city was filled with people who'd escaped slavery, refugees seeking safety behind Union lines. They were called contrabands, a dehumanizing term that treated them as property rather than as people. They needed everything: food, shelter, medical care, education. The conditions were desperate. Harriet and her daughter Louisa Matilda went to work. They were sent by the Society of Friends, Quakers from New York, who supported abolition and wanted to provide relief to the refugees. But Harriet didn't just want to provide relief. She wanted to create something lasting. She wanted to build institutions that would be led by black people, for black people. She established the Jacobs Free School in Alexandria. Construction began in late 1863. By 1864, the school was operational, teaching formerly enslaved children and adults to read and write. Harriet insisted that the school be under black leadership. That was crucial to her. She'd seen too many white abolitionists who wanted to help black people without actually trusting them with power. She wasn't going to replicate that dynamic. The school taught basic literacy, but it was more than that. It was a statement. It said that black people were capable of educating themselves and their children. It said that freedom required more than just the absence of slavery. It required access to knowledge, to skills, to the tools needed to build independent lives. Harriet worked alongside other black women, including Elizabeth Keckley, who'd been enslaved and purchased her own freedom, and became Mary Todd Lincoln's dressmaker, and Mary Dines, another activist working with refugees. She collaborated with white allies like Quaker Julia Wilbur, who'd come to Alexandria to do relief work. These women formed a network, supporting each other, sharing resources, coordinating their efforts to help as many people as possible. Harriet traveled north to raise money for the school and for relief efforts. She gave speeches, she wrote letters, she used her connections in the abolitionist movement to secure funding. She was doing political work while doing relief work, understanding that freedom required more than just ending slavery. It required building new systems, new institutions, new possibilities. She saw firsthand what freedom looked like for people who'd just escaped slavery. She saw their joy and their confusion. She saw their determination and their fear. She saw families reuniting after years of separation. She saw people learning to read for the first time, seeing their own names written down, understanding that they could access knowledge that had been deliberately kept from them. She also saw the challenges. The refugees had no money, no property, no resources. They'd escaped with nothing but their lives. They needed jobs, but the economy was in chaos. They needed housing, but there wasn't enough. They needed medical care, but there weren't enough doctors or supplies. The work was overwhelming. But Harriet kept going. She understood something that we sometimes forget. Personal transformation isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning. Once you've freed yourself, you have a responsibility to help free others. Once you've found your voice, you have an obligation to amplify other voices. Once you've learned to read and write, you teach others to do the same. If this story of turning suffering into service inspires you, share this video to help others discover how one woman's courage created ripples that are still spreading today. Harriet worked through the Civil War and into the Reconstruction era. She saw the promise of that period and the betrayals that followed. She saw black people claim their freedom and then watched as that freedom was systematically undermined by white supremacy reasserting itself in new forms. She saw black men gain the right to vote and then watched as that right was stripped away through violence and legal manipulation. She saw schools built and then burned. She saw hope flourish and then crushed. But she didn't give up. She kept working. She kept fighting. She kept believing that change was possible, that freedom was worth fighting for, that the work mattered even when the progress was slow and the setbacks were devastating. She lived until 1897. She was 84 years old when she died in Washington, D.C. She'd been born into slavery and lived to see it abolished. She'd been property and became a published author. She'd been silenced and became a voice that still echoes today. Now, remember that question I asked at the beginning? How does someone go from being property, from hiding in a coffin-sized space for 7 years, to becoming one of the most important voices in American literature? What happens inside a person during those years of darkness? Here's the answer, and it's not what you might expect. It wasn't that the suffering made her strong. It wasn't that the trauma gave her special powers. That's not how trauma works. The suffering was just suffering. The trauma was just trauma. It broke her body in ways that never fully healed. It left scars that never went away. It took things from her that could never be recovered. What happened was this. Harriet refused to let her oppression define her possibilities. She understood that the people who enslaved her wanted her to believe she was less than human. They wanted her to internalize that lie. They wanted her to accept that she was property, that she had no rights, that she had no future beyond what they decided for her. And she simply refused. Not because she was superhuman, not because she didn't feel fear or pain or despair, but because she understood that accepting their definition of her would be the final defeat. So in that attic, unable to stand, watching her children through a peephole, she made a different choice. She decided that this confinement was temporary, that she was still their mother, that she was still herself, that she was still capable of freedom and dignity and love. She decided that she would survive this, and that when she got out, she would use her freedom to help others claim theirs. And when she finally escaped, when she finally had the physical freedom to match her internal freedom, she didn't stop there. She taught herself to write not just competently, but brilliantly. She crafted a narrative that was both true and artful. She found a way to speak about unspeakable things in a voice that demanded to be heard. She broke silences that were supposed to remain unbroken. She told truths that were supposed to stay hidden. And when people dismissed her truth, when they erased her voice for over a century, the truth didn't disappear. It waited. It endured. Just like she'd endured in that attic. Until finally, someone did the work to prove what should never have been doubted. Harriet's story teaches us something profound about transformation. It's not a straight line from suffering to triumph. It's not a simple narrative of overcoming. It's messier than that. It's more complicated. It's more human. She made choices that some people judged. She entered a relationship with Samuel Sawyer that gave her children but also complicated her story. She accepted having her freedom purchased even though it galled her. She wrote under a pseudonym because she had to protect herself and her family. She made compromises and strategic decisions and did what she had to do to survive and then to thrive. And that's actually more inspiring than a simple hero's tale. Because most of us aren't in situations where the right choice is obvious. Most of us are navigating complicated circumstances where every option has costs. Most of us are trying to maintain our dignity and agency in systems designed to strip us of both. Harriet shows us that transformation requires two things. First, refusing to accept other people's definitions of what you're capable of, and second, using whatever freedom you gain to expand freedom for others. She didn't just survive slavery, she didn't just escape it. She didn't just write about it, she fundamentally changed how we understand it. She broke silences that needed breaking. She built institutions that served her community. She used her voice to amplify other voices. Her story also reveals something crucial about whose voices we trust and whose truths we believe. For over a century, people dismissed Harriet's testimony because they couldn't imagine that a formerly enslaved black woman could write with such sophistication. They used her excellence as evidence against her authenticity, and that tells us something about how deeply racism and sexism shape what we consider credible. How many other voices have been dismissed? How many other truths have been erased? How many other stories are we still treating as fiction because we can't imagine that the people who lived them could also tell them with power and artistry? According to Jean Faga-Yellin's research, Harriet's vindication in 1981 wasn't just about one book or one woman. It was about recognizing that black women's testimonies deserve to be believed. That literary skill and lived experience aren't contradictory. That the people who survive oppression are often the most insightful analysts of how that oppression works. What limitations in your own life might actually be fuel for your greatest transformation? What voices are you dismissing because you can't imagine that the person speaking could have that much insight or skill? What truths are you treating as fiction because they challenge your comfortable assumptions? Harriet Jacobs spent 7 years in a space no taller than a coffin and emerged to write one of the most important books in American history. She was dismissed as a liar for over a century and is now recognized as a pioneering voice in both African American literature and women's literature. She was born property and died free, having helped thousands of others claim their freedom too. Her story isn't just history, it's a blueprint. It shows us that transformation is possible even from the most brutal starting conditions, that claiming your voice matters even when people try to silence you, that using your freedom to expand freedom for others is how we actually change the world. Share your thoughts in the comments. What part of Harriet's story resonates most with you? What limitations are you ready to transform into fuel for your own journey? Let's continue this conversation because Harriet's story doesn't end with her. It continues through every person who refuses to accept other people's definitions of what they're capable of. It continues through every voice that speaks truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable. It continues through you.